in very late 2002 and mostly 2003. There are about, currently there are 203,000 people living in the parts of, I'll call this occasionally the West Bank and occasionally Judea and Samaria, and more about the terminology in a bit, but there are about 203,000 people living in the parts of the West Bank that Israel would annex and make part of its country under this plan. Of these 203,000 people, 193,000 of them are Jews, and 10,000 of them are Palestinian Arabs. And the land in question is about 7% of Judea and Samaria. About 7% of Judea and Samaria, and 93% of it would then be, under this plan, would then be deemed to be outside the borders of Israel. Of course, this is controversial. This became controversial in Israel immediately. Israel had withdrawn from Gaza in 2005. Almost immediately there was a coup d'etat, as I'm sure you know, wherein Hamas took over Gaza. Hamas launched over 2,000 missiles onto Israeli territory from Gaza in the year 2007 alone. Since then, fewer missiles, but still quite a few. About a missile a day in 2010, for example, and about 10 per week, a little bit more than a missile a day in 2011 so far. The administration of President Bush, George W. Bush, the previous administration, gently indicated in ways that I could describe and have described in print that it was not opposed to a unilateral Israeli setting of borders under these circumstances, but other elements of the international community wasted no time in decrying Israel's efforts to incorporate this 7% of Judea Samaria into Israel. Speaking to the European Parliament, Javier Solana, the European Union's top foreign policy official, lamented the, quote, lack of dialogue with the Palestinian people in determining Israel's borders. Former President Jimmy Carter, who is rarely outdone in his criticism of Israel, wrote in USA Today that Prime Minister Olmert's 2006 program was, quote, a naked land grab, quote, a violation of international law, quote, that no objective member of the international community could accept. And then the New York Times on May 25th, 2006, labeled President Bush, Hamas, and the Israeli government two culprits and an enabler. Hamas and Israel apparently being the culprits and President Bush being the enabler because of Israel's plan to unilaterally set its borders. So in the view of Solana, in the view of Carter, and in the view of the Times editorial board, the boundary between Israel and its Arab neighbors that prevailed between 1949 and 1967, more about that history obviously in a bit, is not just a historical baseline, it's a legitimate international border, one that according to these people, the Jewish state has ignored now for nearly 4 decades. So as these people see it, the Six-Day War of 1967, about which more later, resulted in an occupation of Judea Samaria, as well as of the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and parts of Jerusalem. Much as that occupation might have been required by the exigencies of the time, these critics believe that it gives Israel no ongoing title to those lands, and indeed, in the view of these critics, Israel's long-term presence in the West Bank is nothing less than an ongoing crime. It's this legal view, so that, in a nutshell, is the legal view that my talk today is aimed at rebutting. Okay? So I want to organize my remarks in the following way. First, I'd like to talk about the relevant legal acts and their implication for the status of Israel's borders. Then I'd like to talk more specifically about Judea Samaria and the protective wall that Israel has almost completed but not quite completed building. Very briefly, before concluding, I'll talk about WikiLeaks and the effects of the recent WikiLeaks on various what I call myths about the Middle East. And then I'll conclude. And first, though, I'd like, with your indulgence, to engage, and this is really sort of parenthetical to my talk today, but I think it is important to dispel, as Mr. Indig indicated, some conceptions that some people may have that aren't historically based. So if you permit me, I'd just like to make a very brief historical aside before beginning my remarks proper. This aside is historical and not about borders. I heartily recommend to you to Google the recent articles highlighting the importance of the Latin language book Palestina. It was a book written in the Latin language, as I indicate, in 1714 by the Dutch cartographer Hadirani Rolandi, or Adrian Roland, as he's known in English. This cartographer is a remarkable man. He spoke fluent Arabic, fluent Hebrew, he even spoke ancient Greek. And he went on a sightseeing tour in what is today Israel and the West Bank. In his travels, he exhaustively mapped and arranged a census of approximately 2,500 people, 2,500 places where people lived. One of his explicit observations was that there were Jewish settlements and there were Arabic settlements, but that not one Arabic settlement had an original Arabic name. Most place names were of Hebrew or Greek origin, and in the Arabic settlements, the names of Hebrew or Greek origin had been distorted, sometimes to senseless Arabic names, where the Arabic population was in a majority. There's no meaning in Arabic to names such as Akko, Haifa, Jaffa, Nablus, in Hebrew Shechem, Gaza, or Jenin. Names like Ramallah and El-Quds, El-Quds being the Arabic name for Jerusalem, names like Ramallah and El-Quds, which seem to be obvious Arabic names, lack historical roots or Arabic philology. For example, Ramallah was originally called Beit El, House of the Lord, Beit El, Hebrew. Then that became Beit Allah, obviously, Beit Allah instead of Beit El, and then Ram Allah. In the Galilee, Nazareth was entirely a Christian outpost. Jerusalem was a large agglomeration, 5,000 people, mostly Jews with a sprinkling of Christians. Gaza had 550 people, 50% Jews, and the rest mostly Christians. Tiberias and Safed, or Tzfat in Hebrew, were mostly Jewish. Lake Kinneret, or Sea of Galilee, in Lake Kinneret, the town of el-Fahem, was a village where 10 families, all Christian, lived. His survey, Roland's survey, is really quite exhaustive. It's remarkable. As I was saying, he spoke perfect Hebrew and perfect Arabic. His book, I think, gives the lie to the idea that circulates widely that there is a millennial Palestinian Arabic heritage to the area. And let me point out, this is very different than, for example, Granada and Andalusia in Spain, which do have true Arabic civilization with names, culture, monumental creations, etc. But this was not the situation for the area that we're talking about. The Arab population that Rolandi surveyed were mostly nomadic Bedouins who took jobs as seasonal agricultural workers. The largest Arab sedentary population that Rolandi found was in Nablus, with 190 Arab residents. Meanwhile, large Jewish towns in Judea and Samaria, such as Hebron, existed throughout all the centuries of Ottoman and foreign rule. That's the aside, and I'll now pass to the bulk of my remarks. With respect to Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, the first modern document of legal import that I want to talk to you about dates from the San Remo Conference of 1920, where the victorious Allied powers of World War I assigned the League of Nations mandate for Palestine to Great Britain. In doing so, they recognized, in the words of the mandate, quote, the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine, and, quote, the grounds for constituting their national home in that country. Article 4 of the San Remo document, quote, encouraged close settlement by Jews on the land, which land, by the way, very much included what is today Israel, what is today Judea and Samaria, what is today the country of Jordan. In other words, much, much more than what is today.